Hello again, listeners. Today we have an interesting episode for you. Professor Tom Oliver is the author of the best-selling book, The SelfDelusion, The Surprising Science of How We Are Connected and Why That Matters, and is an expert in land use, biodiversity, and much more besides. It was a privilege to enter into a beautifully complex maze of a conversation ranging from the interconnected world, the danger of rampant individualism, sourcing resources ethically, the beauty of bees, apples, and how we maintain a pragmatic balance amongst all these multifaceted scenarios. Oh, and don't forget, World Bee Day is coming up on the 20th of May as well. Enjoy the discussion. So hello, Tom, and welcome to the Discover Reading podcast. So the first question is our usual one. So who are you, Tom, and what do you do?
Hi, so I'm a professor of applied ecology, and I'm based in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Reading. My research is initially started out focusing on wildlife, so butterflies, birds, trying to analyse these data sets which track population numbers, and then relating that to things like how we manage our landscapes in terms of farming or the effects of climate change. I've since moved on from that, working a bit more on environmental risk. So it started by looking at what's the effect of these wildlife declines on things like pollination or pest control or decomposition, and how that affects humans. So how we face these environmental risks, and that's moved into more sort of generic environmental risk managements, understanding how ecological and social systems are linked together. So I've had a couple of secondments with government, one with DEFRA and the current one with Go Science, which is the Government Office for Science, and that's advising on methods to understand those systems and the risks that they pose.
That's fantastic. And yeah, one of the kind of areas of your research that brought us to you was kind of looking at the decline in bee numbers and things like that. So that kind of touches on some of the areas that you've mentioned, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But me and Chris did also notice that you're the author of a book recently called The SelfDelusion, The Surprising Science of How We're Connected and Why It Matters. And so that's, another kind of area of your research as well. And it looks like an absolutely fantastic book, actually. We were just talking about it before the episode. So, yeah, could you just say a bit more about kind of the premise of the book and what's it about, and a summary of it, really?
Yeah, sure, I can. Yeah, the self-delusion it's the mistaken belief that we exist as very independent, discrete, isolated entities, and when you actually look at the science, whether it's biological sciences around how our bodies are made, the cells in our bodies, or whether it's the sort of psychological science around our minds, that's revealed to be essentially a mistaken belief. So just to give you some examples, in terms of biology, we're composed of cells, of course, and many of those skin cells, for example, or gut cells last just a few weeks, and actually all the cells in our body are continually turning over, and we rebuild that body continually. So when you stand in a mirror, it looks like this is me, but actually that physical form is comprised of those cells that are turning over, but also lots of bacterial cells. We have almost an equal number of bacterial cells in our body as human cells, as well as fungi and protozoa, and these all affect our moods and our behaviors. So when you stand in front of the mirror, that looks like you, and it's your DNA that builds that structure that you recognize as yourself. But that DNA in itself is borrowed from our ancestors. We look like our parents and our grandparents, and we pass it on to ancestors to come. And across the tree of life, actually DNA is carried horizontally as well as vertically. So we have, of the many thousands of genes we have, about 150 of them at least are carried horizontally, vectored by viruses. So humans have genes that were from rabbits, for example, that control the development of the placenta. So the tree of life is actually more like a tangled thicket, and actually we're much more connected to each other and other species than we think. And psychologically, every smell, every touch, every word, it changes our kind of the composition of our neural networks in our brains and changes who we are. So we're continually changing all the time. There's no fixed entity that is sort of discrete and unchanging. So even hidden influences like pheromones, these are smell chemicals. When you're in a room with someone, they can be producing these chemicals which can either make you feel anxious or happy through a sort of contagion effect, all below the sort of conscious radar. So really, there's a lot of science suggesting that this idea that we're discrete entities is an illusion. And I call it a delusion because it's a harmful illusion, actually, because when we feel very isolated, we tend to be less happy and more anxious and depressed. But also it has big implications for the environment as well. So when people feel, when they're more individualistic, they tend to be more selfish. It kind of makes sense. But conversely, if we feel more connected to other people and to nature, we tend to sort of care for them more. It's sort of like an act of self-love, essentially, because they become part of our self-identity. So we choose to, buy products that are more sustainable. We volunteer for environmental causes. We're more careful about how we travel, reducing, greenhouse gas emissions. So really, there's a danger that as the world moves towards, greater individualism, it's bad for the environment. So that's why I call it the self-delusion. And really, my hope is that by revealing some of this science around our connectedness, we can maybe gradually help people change their mindsets, as well as motivating them to adopt practices that can help with that. So that might be, engaging with nature, going outdoors, or, meditating, or there's various different approaches that we can use to actually change our mindsets to feel more connected to nature.
Okay, fascinating. And I think the breakdown of the science and what the science actually reveals, and then comparing that to, I think you're right in saying that today's world, it's basically dominated by individualism. If you look at all the consumerism, or the focus upon yourself, basically, it does feel like everyone individualism is the quite dominated strand. And I thought it was quite interesting in the introduction of the book when you said, how would a alien perceive it if they came down? And they would perceive it much more as if you want the kind of race of humans, and they would just see you as being, if you want, kind of one part of that web, as opposed to necessarily seeing you as the individuals. But I was also curious as well, Tom, what do you think, if you want a more collective society, would look like, where people think of themselves as being much more of this part of a interconnected part of the world? And do you actually think that this is possible? Is this something which, for example, existed more in past generations, or is what you are proposing something which would be quite new to humanity?
I think definitely you're right. I mean, we're kind of at a peak of individualism in a way, and there's been various analyses that have looked at that. So individualism has been increasing in the majority of countries around the world over the last 50 years or so. And I'm hoping that we're kind of sort of inflection point where things start to change, and we're recognizing that the limits of this individualistic approach. Now, I should say, this is not about abolishing the idea of a self or an ego. We need that, and we evolved a sense of self. It's an important way that we, get food, we manage social interactions. We couldn't just float around with zero sense of self. But this is about rebalancing, and you're right when you talk about those cultural influences, whether it's our governments, what they kind of social modelling, Boris Johnson saying greed is good, and Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society, only individuals, or whether it's our education systems, keep encouraging to build self-esteem and sell yourself as a brand, or whether it's the media kind of saying, you're worth it, etc. So all these influences, our minds kind of soak that culture up like a sponge, and it affects how we think. So the argument really is that the culture has exacerbated that and pushed our kind of mindsets too far towards that highly individualistic end of the spectrum. And maybe we can rebalance and develop a more collective society. And really, we absolutely need to do that to kind of get through this sustainability crisis that we face. Just to give you an analogy of a sort of similar argument, the tendency to eat fatty foods is a good example, where it's something that evolved as an adaptation. We seek out those foods in prehistoric times because they were scarce. So it benefited you to find highly sugary or fatty food sources. But in the modern world, our cultures kind of make those food sources hyper abundant, and they're cheap, they're marketed to people. It's very difficult to get other types of food sometimes. So that leads to, it's led to an obesity epidemic where over a quarter of the world's population, over 2 billion people, are overweight or obese. So this is a case where you've got a biological adaptation, but in a modern context, the culture, it makes it maladaptive. And that's my argument for the sense of self, that, we need it, of course, but actually the argument is that the pendulum swung too far, and this is about rebalancing and kind of balancing the individual benefits with the kind of collective good, and thinking about future generations, of course, as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I was just thinking, actually, with some of those examples, and you sort of mentioned people building their own brand, and you think of people spending a lot of time on social media, worrying about their image, spending a lot of time in the gym, or thinking about cosmetic surgery and all those kind of things. They are kind of quite solo, individualistic things, but the irony is that people are doing those things because they're worried about how other people will perceive them. So it's kind of a contradiction of people are becoming more individualistic and maybe withdrawing a little bit, but they're doing it because they are worried about what other people think. It's a sort of a contradiction. I wonder whether you think that's perhaps similar to what you were saying about kind of obesity, where it's just the way kind of modern things have gone, where something which, that drive to fit in a modern world, the outcomes of that are a bit unhealthy.
Absolutely, yeah. It's kind of taken too far in a way. Having an ego is about kind of, in one sense, there's a sense of reputation, but gone too far, it can kind of degrade into a sense of anxiety, or the constant anxiety. Am I performing well enough, etc. That sense of reputation was important, in when we evolved in sort of smaller groups of, tens or hundreds of individuals. That sense of self was important because we had to manage those interactions in a group. We had to balance the kind of group identity, our individual identity. And if we were too selfish, then we'd be, stealing food from the group. We'd be punished, But now we live in this sort of world of, billions of individuals that we interact with. And that kind of control, it has been lifted, essentially. And then the kind of runaway escalation of individualism has occurred. And I think our kind of, our economies become globalized, our impacts on the environment have become globalized, but our way we deal with our social interactions and our morality is still kind of lagging behind. And I think there's a lot more that can be done in our modern world about sort of inner development, as opposed to just this kind of outer technological development that we see.
Fascinating. And there was a question I wanted to ask you about religion, but before I kind of get onto that, and maybe I'll give Phil a chance as well because I'm sure he's got another question to get a question in first. Because you also mentioned football in the introduction, it did actually get me thinking, Tom, the introduction of your book, because I'm currently doing my dissertation research for Afghanistan. And one of the interesting things in the early stages of that war, and it's maybe a little bit of a dark thing to go and think about, but the best armies, the best armed forces, they all have always now got to operate in conjunction. So the Air Force has to operate with the Army, all the different facets of the Army, the logistics, the platoons, they all have to operate in this interconnected way. And if they fail to do that, then the entire operation fails. And then likewise, if you think about it in terms of football, if you look at the very best team, I'm a big Liverpool fan, so I very much enjoy watching Liverpool play, and they're doing quite well. I'm not quite sure how well this comment is going to age as time goes on, but the best two teams in the Premier League moment, Liverpool and City, they are, if you want, that you can see the power of the team behind them. Compare that to, say, for example, a team such as Manchester United, historically great, but now a team of individuals struggling. Do you think that this is one of the problems within society, which is we've essentially been told to operate as individuals, but particularly in the West, that in a way is now creating individuals? Because if you operate purely as yourself and purely operate as the individual, you lose that ability, which is something quite historic, to operate with others and understand and appreciate that there might be something greater than yourself, such as, let's say, building a good community. I think Phil mentioned it for later generations.
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I think there's a danger of that. Yeah, that excessive focus on being an individual and competing against others in a global marketplace. It's very stressful, competing against everyone in the whole world. But equally, yeah, it's a sort of it's a zero-sum game in a way, because there's a lot of problems that need that collective cooperation to deal with. I should say, though, I think there's we identify at different levels. We have an ego, but also we identify obviously with our families, we identify with our towns, our football teams, with our country, and we can have a more sort of global identity as well. And we can have these sort of simultaneously, and we can put different weights on kind of how much we identify at the different levels. And I think that there can, even with group identity, sometimes be a danger of, an over excessive attachment to a group. So, football support is a healthy, activity, but hooliganism, degrades, and, at a different level, having pride in your country is good, but being highly nationalistic and xenophobic, it starts to degrade into something which is bad. So with all these things, it's about balance. And I think that across that spectrum of the sort of hierarchy of identity, from the sort of ego and town and football team and country and global identity, I think we've been too focused at the sort of narrow ends. And actually, there's some argument that in a globalized world where a lot of environmental problems are globalized themselves, they're transboundary, they span international borders. So things like biodiversity loss, things like air pollution drifting across continents, things like climate change, ocean pollution, these are all international problems. And so you need pandemics is a good one. You need more international cooperation to deal with them. And the danger is, I suppose, that in the face of some shocks that we might have, like pandemic or climate, floods or other extreme weather events, we get a kind of retraction to a smaller group. And that's a kind of, again, it's an adaptive response, how humans have coped in the past. We stick together in a smaller group under adversity. But in the face of a globalized problem, it's kind of a maladaptive response. You need to go the other way. So things like, Donald Trump suggesting they should build a wall and, lock their country in, America first, and withdraw funding from the World Health Organization, a bit more of an objective look at these problems with a longer term and a bigger spatial scale. These are kind of maladaptive responses to deal with a global pandemic or global climate change. So I think, a lot of this is about balance at these different kind of levels.
Okay. My question is a bit about kind of how optimistic we can be really in these terms. So I guess the idea of society where you've got people who are very highly educated and kind of go through their lives like they're philosophers, that's been around since at least sort of Plato's Republic. You've got more recent books like is it the chimp paradox, talking about you've got the rational part of your brain, and then we are just clever primates who have like a irrational animal part of our brain. I do find myself leaning towards looking at kind of human society and seeing that the kind of animalistic primate side of our brain is quite a big barrier to get past. And like you're talking about kind of climate science, and you've got Greta Thunberg sort of pointing out this is threatening life on the planet. Why aren't we doing more? And yet we don't seem to be doing enough. And there's always that kind of almost like chimp side to us where it's like, well, yeah, tomorrow's, and we'll do it tomorrow or whatever. I guess that is all very a pessimistic view of humans, but I wonder what your view on that is, and how optimistic you are that we can kind of get past the chimp side of our brain and just be more rational and actually do what we need to do, even if it's uncomfortable, but in terms of climate change and things like that.
Yeah, good questions. I think just to deal with the last part, I think it's not just about developing the rationality and getting away from the kind of the animal sides of our beings. Actually, one argument might say we've kind of developed that kind of intellect, that very sort of abstract thinking intellect, and it's outpaced some of our kind of deeper sort of spiritual wisdom, and some of that is about kind of understanding our emotions better, emotional intelligence, and things like being mindful about how we eat and how our actions and our behaviors. That kind of is about being in touch a lot with those kind of physiological aspects and our emotional aspects as well. So I think that's one element, that sort of that human development. I think we kind of need to turn inwards again. I think we've had several decades or hundreds of years of rapid technological expansion, but often the kind of deeper questions about, do we want this? Where are we heading? Is this technology right? Rather than allowing kind of, international corporations to just simply dominate what happens to society. The argument for more kind of participatory approaches to technology development and based on a kind of wisdom about how we want to live and sustainability, I think is important. I mean, in terms of optimism, pessimism, I think we are at crossroads. There's no denying it. In one sense, there's some sort of negative view where individualism increasing. We've got all these global problems. Whether it's climate change or pollution or obesity or inequality, it's kind of like a mega crisis in a way, and all these problems are linked. But at the same time, we've got some really hopeful shoots of kind of, you mentioned the kind of school Greta Thunberg and the school climate strikes and the groups like Extinction Rebellion that are sort of trying to paint a new narrative of a more kind of global identity, that we're all in this together and we have to think about future generations and maybe, sometimes live less not wealthy in the terms of we can still be prosperous and flourish, but actually using less resources and doing less damage to the planet on a per capita basis. So we're definitely at a crossroads, and I think in our mindsets as well. Each of us individuals can sometimes feel us being tugged in those different directions, and in one sense, it might be gloomy looking at the kind of picture. But I think one thing to say is, social change can happen very quickly, as sort of past history demonstrates, and you get this kind of contagion effects where a few people changing, because we influence each other, through these, social networks. You can influence people that you've never even met. Your risk of obesity, your taste in music, your voting preferences, you're actually influencing people you've never even met because of just this sort of contagion effect about how we influence one person, and that kind of ripples across these networks. In an optimistic sense, a lot of these big global problems that seem so daunting, actually some of the solutions are in our own mindsets, which is sort of an empowering message. And equally, if we can change those mindsets, we can actually cascade out and cause those kind of social ripples and social tipping points. So there is optimism there. I do think things are going to get worse in one sense in terms of these environmental shocks that we're kind of locked in now about climate change and resource depletion. But so a big question is, how can we continue to kind of allow human flourishing in the face of this adversity and not kind of retract back and take the wrong path, as things start to really get tough, that we don't sort of suddenly, batten down the hatches and say, right, we've got to do this as a nation, or we've got to do this as a town, or, and just lose all that international cooperation that we really need. So that's a real challenge, I think, is that kind of, human flourishing and international cooperation under conditions of adversity.
Certainly, and certainly, international cooperation has never been easy. But if you look back at the history of humanity, things such as, for example, in the Second World War, the rebuilding of Western Europe, the Bretton Woods Conference, it's been done to different forms before. So maybe that is one source of hope. The other thing which I was quite curious to go and ask you, Tom, which might be a source of hope, is that obviously, many people, particularly in the UK, are no longer religious. But if you look at the history of religion, and I think you may touch upon it in your book, it's the question of, why did past societies believe? What did those societies get out of it? Was religion essential for those societies to progress? And it's something which I've always been quite curious about, which is, has the loss of religion in a way created a few problems? And one of it could just be that people become too individualistic, because some of the good things which religion can do is give people that sense of community, that sense of collective hope, the kind of idea that there is something greater for themselves which they can believe in. And at points, some people who might be more critical of people like Greta Thunberg, they often criticize and they say, oh, all of these environmental movements are a bit like religion. I suppose one counter to them would be to say, sure, like you said about football hooliganism, ideas and beliefs can always be taken too far. But is it really such a bad thing that people such as Greta and other people who are like-minded have that zeal? Is that not a potential cause for hope? And is there actually something quite deep within humans and humanities that there is a yearning for, if you want, collective beliefs and collective identity, and if you want collective goals? And is that a potential source of hope, do you think? Or am I being way too optimistic there?
Yeah, I think it's a complex question. I mean, I think in terms of religion, I agree with what you say, that there is this kind of, as religion is, at least in the sort of many, Western countries, sort of, there's a much greater degree of atheism. I mean, I'm atheistic myself, or maybe pantheistic, in a sense that, thinking that nature is my God, essentially, and it exists. There's kind of awe and wonder in everything, and that's so. You could say it's atheistic, or you could say it's God is in everything. And as that sense of religion has sort of declined, there's been a kind of vacuum in terms of values and moral progress, and I think that is something that definitely does need addressing. And I guess this is my sort of point about a renewed focus on kind of inner development as well as sort of outer development. I think a lot of religions, in some sense, made mistakes because initially they might have been about direct contact, this sort of direct spirituality. Whether that's Buddhism or Christianity or Hinduism, and there's elements in all the religions about kind of direct contact with sort of a sense of awe and wonder and enlarging that we get. But then many of those religions developed sort of structures, and there was a kind of a mediator, whether it was a priest or something, who said, well, I can sort of grant, I'm the one who you have to speak to get in contact with God. So that caused a lot of problems and disruption, and obviously abuse of those positions causes further problems. I think there is an argument for a kind of a spirituality, in the sense that when people feel, for example, a sense of awe around the world, some psychological studies show that changes their sense of identity, so that it becomes larger. They feel part of something bigger, and in turn that's changed sense of identity is associated, as I mentioned at the start, with more pro-environmental behaviours and more pro-social behaviours. So we're more likely to look after the natural world if we feel part of it, or look after other people if we feel that they're kind of part of our bigger group that sort of forms our identity. And religions have been saying for a long time, and philosophers, that self is an illusion, and this kind of idea of a discrete entity is an illusion. And I guess what's sort of more available now is the kind of evidence base to that spirituality. So the science of our connectedness, sort of talked about the things at the start, but also even the practices which allow us to feel more connected. So we can actually measure them now. So, for example, there's a long history of meditation, and lots of studies, there's whole books about this, showing that it actually changes the structure of the brain and actually reduces the ego, the kind of this part of our brain called the default mode network that kind of has this sense of self that kind of self-ruminates, and that is down-regulated in experienced meditators, and they show more compassion and pro-social behaviors. But that takes a lot of time to reach that state. Well, new technologies, neurofeedback mechanisms, can feed your brainwaves as you're learning to meditate, and so you can get to those different mindsets and mental states quicker. Similarly, just to give another example, going out and connecting with nature, and in a group, or sort of being out in nature, observing plants and animals, or drawing plants and animals, or listening to birdsong, all have been shown to increase that sense of nature connectedness, and then again pro-environmental behaviours. But now there are metrics by which we can kind of assess those mindset changes. So, for example, the wildlife trusts and the RSPB in the UK have been sort of quite active in trying to assess how connected to nature children feel, and whether there is this deficit, which has been talked about, and then think about ways that they can improve that. So different pathways to nature connectedness. But we can take a very evidence-based approach, a very scientific approach, to actually, measuring which is the most effective. And there are even sort of, things you might not expect. So playing computer games, we might think of that something, you lock yourself away in a room and it's very antisocial. But there have been studies that show how, certain computer games can be designed to increase empathy in the way they work and the questions that they ask of users. So, and again, that can be measured with psychometric tests. So this sort of evidence based approach to increasing our connectedness, and kind of evidence-based spirituality, as it were, is quite a sort of encouraging avenue, that we're starting to see emerge.
If we maybe change gear slightly, and one thing which I think was quite curious and which we noticed is what you're a bit of an expert on, looking at human land use and the impact this can have upon biodiversity. So we thought just go and flesh this out for our audience. Can you give us a few examples basically of how humanity's use of land has impacted biodiversity? And then also we were slightly curious, is there ever a scenario in which potentially humans can have a positive impact upon biodiversity through their use of land?
Sure, absolutely. So we've massively, transformed our landscapes. I mean, in the UK, as an example, 70% of the land cover is agriculture, and that has huge impacts on our wildlife, on our, plants, animals, soil, biodiversity. The major impact is habitat loss. Just changing, the places that species can live. If you look at an intensive wheat field, there's not a lot of space for nature, essentially. But there are other factors as well, chemical inputs. So that's both the addition of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, so you get those big high yielding crops, actually means that those chemicals leach into the soils, or they go down into water courses, and they cause those higher concentrations of those nutrients. That means you get a predominance of certain types of plants that like them, like stinging nettles or thistles, whereas many of our wildflower plants don't like those high concentrations. So we're seeing a massive reduction in wildflower diversity and knock-on effects on insects as well. And of course there are other impacts of farming as well. Intensive farming can cause a loss of soil biodiversity, cause soil erosion, and so actually in the longer term that can impact our ability to grow food in the future. So the food system itself is not really sustainable, and it's led to an overall loss of biodiversity. Now people talk about kind of crisis, insect declines, insect Armageddon, and it is a crisis. But it's a slow burn crisis. It's been happening for decades, and it's continuing to happen, and we need to do something about it. But it's not something that we're not going to see ecosystems in the UK collapse in the next, year or two. But equally, we do need to act, because we can see this trajectory. It's clearly evidenced, and biodiversity is essential for us. Those insects, for example, pollinate our crops. Across the world, the majority of food we eat is pollinated by insects, and there are other benefits of that wildlife as well, in terms of decomposing waste, purifying fresh water, the plants sequestering carbon. So really the way the fundamental ways that our ecosystems function and provide us with a sort of life support system is in the longer term under threat from the way we use land. It's also exacerbated by climate change as well. So as the climate changes, there can be further impacts. So for example, some of my own research, we're looking at butterfly populations, and they tend to suffer in a drought event. When it gets very dry, the populations disappear. But we found that they disappear more where the landscapes are much more degraded and there's less natural habitat for them, and they recover less quickly as well. So if you've got a local extinction, you need new individuals to be moving through the landscape to recolonize it. But if you've kind of fragmented all that natural habitat, they don't get back there quick enough. So really you see this kind of double-edged sword of climate change and land use change. And so, that science helps us to sort of understand some of the options we have in terms of the way we manage land. But really, we need to look at the kind of the root causes of those issues as well. And I said it's 70% of our land's devoted to food, and even then we still import a lot of our food from other countries, causing damage elsewhere. And so it's this global food system which is really driving biodiversity loss. And some of the solutions, they don't necessarily lie in ecology. They maybe lie in economics or even psychology, and some of the things we talked about around what we choose to buy on a daily basis is either propping up that intensive food system, or it's helping it to be transformed into something more sustainable. So there's some sort of deeper questions there about how we transform that food system as well.
Definitely. And I think that when you were talking about kind of, or you can see the trajectory of these things kind of in the future, I often think about governments. They might be in for like 4 years, and they're very focused on their term in office, and it's quite hard to get them to think about things that are longer term, even if you can see that trajectory is heading in one direction. So I guess my point is, I suppose, are you saying that it is up to society to make that change? Because I guess if people are asking for governments to be more forward looking rather than their policies to just be about here and now in the next few years, that's how they'll change. Is that kind of your viewpoint? Because I think governments they are just chasing votes, really. So they'll do what they know, where they can get the votes, rather than necessarily what's right and wrong, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need that kind of deeper cultural shift that then sort of, if you think about our institutions, not just government, but our education systems, our legal systems, the way we develop our businesses and technology, they're all kind of made up of people's worldviews, essentially. And if we want to change those institutions, we kind of need that deeper change in worldview. And actually, unless we get that, we can't, that we'll have this inertia, we'll have this kind of lock-in that we kind of, people have been suggesting technological fixes or economic tweaks to try to solve these big wicked problems of climate change and obesity and pollution, and they're just not getting anywhere. They're kind of sticking plaster fixes that are not effective. And so, yeah, a lot of my focus now has been trying to sort of think about the deeper, root causes of these problems, so that we can really make sure we target our interventions, more effectively to allow that transformation.
And kind of thinking about, because you mentioned, the use of land and the impact this will have upon soil. It reminds me slightly of, I was listening to another podcast, and there was a guest on it called Sadhguru, and he was an expert in terms of soil and erosion. I'm curious to get your opinion on this. He made the claim that one of the problems within our current food systems is often due to the erosion of soil and soil losing its nutritional value. It means that often the food we produce is going to have less of a health benefit. So, for example, a kind of potato or strawberry which you ate 100 years ago would have been better for you. If you look at, for example, the vitamin intake, then a strawberry would be for you now. Is there quite a lot of truth to that claim? And if there is truth to that claim, what's the kind of action we can take? Because I presume it's going to be quite a long burning issue, and there won't be a quick and easy fix to it.
Yeah, it is true. I mean, I've seen some papers around how different minerals and nutrients in certain foods have been declining over time, and another sort of parallel issue to that is the diversity of the crop varieties that we have. Well, the diversity of food types. So, we rely now mostly in the food system on just several key sort of carbohydrates, and also the varieties. We used to have in this country, for example, was a sort of hotspot of kind of apple diversity, and yet you go to the supermarket, there's only sort of 4 or 5 varieties, often imported from elsewhere. And the extent to which, the market is or companies are sort of causing that by essentially picking characteristics, that last longer on the shelf, or it's cheaper for them to transport and buy, rather than this, looking at metrics like the vitamin content of foods. So I think, that is a sort of problem that can be perhaps addressed a bit more by thinking about what do we want the food system to achieve. If you want it just to achieve the delivery of calories to the most people, I mean, it's doing that to some degree. Arguably, it's not doing it completely effectively, because there's a huge proportion of the population in the globe who are malnourished as well. 2 billion people overweight and obese, 2 billion people malnourished and deficient in some kind of nutrient. So it's not very effective in that sense either, as well as degrading biodiversity, freshwater quality, driving climate change. We all science policy initiatives, from the Food Agriculture Organization to the UN, are talking about a transformation of the food system. So that's absolutely something we need to do. And the soil question, again, because of this effects on erosion of soils, loss of soil biodiversity, compaction of soils. Some estimates have said, in certain areas of the country, that we may only have, 60 seasons left before the soil's impoverished. I'm not a soil expert. I don't know how credible those projections for the sort of East Anglia region of the UK are, but I think it's a bit like all these arguments. We don't know where the threshold is really. We can try to gather our evidence, just like biodiversity loss. We know eventually if we keep losing species, the kind of wheels are going to fall off and the ecosystems are going to collapse. But it's very difficult to say how many kind of, nuts and bolts you can lose from this complex ecosystem before it crashes. But we just know that the warning lights are starting to show. And actually the benefits of changing course are not just to prevent that kind of ecosystem collapse. They're, as we said, so that we can be surrounded by flourishing nature, so that we can get better vitamins in our food, so that people have better jobs, that not just packing shelves in warehouses, they could be out, growing organic food in a community garden or something, So there are lots of benefits and no regrets sort of solutions to transforming these systems as well.
Okay, brilliant. And that actually leads us quite well on to our next question about quality of life and being more in touch with nature. And we wondered if you knew of any kind of societies or nations that were managing their interconnected relationship with nature quite well.
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of, for example, indigenous cultures have had a very different understanding of our kind of human-nature relationship. And actually, they're all, there's a lot of diversity, a huge amount, but many of them have a kind of common thread that they see nature as a kind of ancestor and that sort of sense of mother nature. And actually, a lot of South American countries, for example, even modern countries like Costa Rica and Ecuador have kind of written nature into their constitutions and given even citizenship rights to bees and moths and bats, for example, in some cases as a way to protect them. And Costa Rica is a great example of a country that's really sort of leading the way in sustainability. And actually, a lot of those Central American, South American countries have this this concept of Mother Nature, and the Western idea that nature is something for us, that we use it as a kind of resource, very sort of instrumentalist mindset, is actually not necessarily the most common around the world. But there's a global assessment recently called the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's essentially what the IPCC is for climate. This was the idea. This is an international organization to assess what's happening to wildlife and ecosystems. And they initially started out with this framing saying, nature is for people and it provides what they call ecosystem services. And it's this very instrumentalist mindset, utilitarian. And actually, many of these global countries in the global south rejected it and say, look, this is not how we see nature. This is not how it works for us. And as a consequence, this platform, IPBES, had to change, really accommodate that. And they've, to their credit, they've now conducted a new assessment, a values assessment, which is trying to understand all the different ways that different cultures view nature, and really, take a much of a learning mindset, and stepping away from this kind of idea that we're at the forefront of human development. Actually, say we can learn a lot from these different cultures, and yeah, I think certainly there's definitely lessons we can learn from a lot of those indigenous worldviews about how we view our relationship to the natural world.
That's really interesting, and yeah, I guess one thing, and do correct me if I'm wrong, kind of thinking about those cultures such as Costa Rica and the indigenous ones, which you just mentioned, is that practically, I presume many of their resources come locally, or they are locally sourced. Whereas I think, as you were saying before, like with the apples, much of the kind of resources which we consume are not locally sourced, and they have to be kind of shipped from across the world. Is that, if you think about it practically in terms of solutions, is this something which kind of governments could do better? Is it try and do as much as possible with resources which are currently here? Like my flatmate, he works for Marks and Spencers, and he was saying about how huge amounts of our onions, for example, are imported. But if my history serves me correctly, we used to grow onions just fine in this country. So is that something which we could do better, and kind of try and actually source much of our food locally?
Yeah, I think We definitely could, and there's a big argument for building sort of community locally, both for the sort of social benefits, but also there's the food growing benefits. You know, having, for example, community farms and community gardens is a really powerful way of, you know, building social bonds and also producing food locally. The caveat is, of course, you know, not all foods that we eat can be grown in this country. So, for example, tomatoes is a good example that, you know, it might use more electricity to grow them in lit greenhouses in the UK than it would be to import them from Spain. And so, you know, there is an argument for trade and allowing countries to do what they do best based on their kind of, you know, geology and based on their skills. So, you know, we certainly shouldn't, in this kind of New World Order, say it's all about kind of protectionism and going back to a sort of complete self-sufficiency. I think, you know, there's a definite balance to be struck between reducing food miles, building community, building self-sufficiency and resilience at the national level, versus still maintaining the benefits of a kind of efficiency of you know, allowing countries to trade products in something that they do well, and not having every country try and produce every you know, good that they use or food that they eat. I think it's not an easy challenge, and actually the UK government has been struggling with this in the sense that they've developed a national food strategy now, and one of the arguments is to become more self-sufficient from a sort of resilience perspective as well, in terms of, you know, we know there's going to be increasing food shocks globally with climate change and geopolitical shocks. I mean, you see it with the Russian-Ukraine war, with the wheat prices that are being impacted. So there's a big argument for this. Now it's down to the nuts and bolts about which foods you should specialize in and where, and you know, how that all works. And I think it's sort of case by case basis, really.
Okay, perfect. And I guess that kind of returns to that word balance, like you were saying, it's always balance which is key. And I guess moving on from balance to bees as well. So we've got World Bee Day coming up on May the 20th. What is this exactly? And maybe, you know, wider explain, you can also explain just why bees are so critical in nature.
World Bee Day. It sounds fascinating. I'd like to say the World Bee is a special bee species that lives in the centre of the planet and emerges on the 20th of May and pollinates all the orchids in one day. But actually, World Bee Day, of course, is all about all bees. It's about bumblebees, honeybees, solitary bees, and it's on the 20th of May. It was actually put forward by Slovenia to the UN, and the UN have recognised it, and so it's an international day. And it's really trying to raise the profile of bees as important parts of our ecosystems, providing pollination for our food. You know, we're absolutely dependent on them. So there's that kind of element of how they support us, but just also the kind of the beauty of different bees and insects in general. I think it's raising the profiles of people kind of are more aware of their environment and kind of, you know, take a moment to notice bees and what they do for us, and that helps to, again, we talked about, build that sense of connection to nature and awareness of nature, which has a whole set of other attendant benefits. So I guess, yeah, World Bee Day is one kind of part of this bigger picture of trying to encourage people. You know, we live in towns now, in cities, we don't see as much of nature as we would have done, and so we need to sometimes make sort of extra efforts to be mindful of nature and, you know, recognizing its value, but also things like, you know, actions we can take, like, you know, planting flowers in our gardens and, you know, rewilding initiatives around our towns and villages to try and encourage nature and kind of move ourselves away from this sort of disconnection where we live in these kind of hermetically sealed urban centres and forget about our kind of huge dependencies upon the natural world.
Definitely. And with the decline of bee numbers, is that particularly the loss of wildflowers, or what are the kind of causes of that?
So there are a number of causes, and I think it's easy to oversimplify and say it's all because of neonicotinoid pesticides, you know, that have been shown to be linked to impacting bees, impacting the way they forage, for example. But actually, even before those pesticides, there were, you know, habitat loss was driving a lot of loss of, you know, bee populations, as well as loss of wildflowers as well, as talked about, kind of the higher nutrient levels and nitrogen deposition in landscapes causes a loss of wildflowers, and if there's less wildflowers, then there's less bees as well. So it works both ways. So there are a whole range of different causes for the loss of bee species, but we kind of know what we need to do in terms of the basics of restoring habitats, increasing floral diversity, planting wildflowers, for example, or just letting these areas restore themselves naturally, reducing our reliance on inorganic fertilizers. So organic farming is much better in a way that those nutrients don't get leached out into landscapes as easily, reducing our reliance on pesticides as well. So yeah, there's a whole range of different reasons why bees are declining, but we kind of know the answer. It's more about the kind of political will and also the motivation amongst all of us to sort of chip in and decide in our own lives how we can best protect nature.
Okay, brilliant. And I'm just thinking about what we can do to help. Is it you see kind of organic foods in the supermarket, and are those, how kind of helpful are you being by choosing to buy organic? Because obviously there's that argument that they are often that much more expensive, and it can feel a little bit intangible in terms of whether you're actually doing good or what benefits you're getting from buying organic.
Yeah, we definitely need better food labeling so we can kind of understand of our products, and it is unfortunately quite complicated because there's how much carbon emissions embedded in the product, what's its contribution to climate change, how much water did it use, what's its impact on biodiversity of the production of that product. So there's a whole kind of range of metrics, and I know there are initiatives out there to try to think about sort of more simple labeling system, as a sort of traffic light system for the sustainability of different products, and that would help. I mean, generally organic has lower impacts for sure and is better for wildlife, but of course it is more expensive, and certain people won't be able to afford that, basically. And so, we need also more structural approaches where, governments can sort of incentivize better that the food system doesn't, essentially cheaper products that are produced unsustainably can undercut products that are more sustainable. And so there are different economic levers that you can use, putting more a tax on, where a polluter pays. If they're polluting the environment, and they pay a tax, and that goes to subsidize products that are protecting the environment. There are different ways that you can manage that, but it definitely needs those structural fixes as well as our choices. But yeah, generally, I mean, I try to buy organic personally because I think it has a lower environmental impact, less chance of some of the sort of, I don't know how dangerous the chemicals are, but they're, we don't in many cases know what a lot of these chemicals do as they sort of in the longer term that are used on foods. So that reduces that risk to some degree. And I think it helps incentivize the whole system to gradually shift. If organic farmers are doing better, then they can expand. And we see an increased acreage of organic farming now across the UK and across Europe. So, but yeah, completely recognise that that's a sort of luxury, I guess, that you might have if you can afford it. So it's definitely challenging. But there are other things we can do as well, getting out in nature, volunteering for environmental organisation, making sure the way we travel as much as possible is low, more sustainable. So everyone can make choices in what the clothes we choose to buy. We all have choices, no matter our level of kind of income. So it's just thinking a bit more deeply about our values and ensuring that our behaviours kind of align with that. And it's easy to say that, but it's I think everyone finds that challenging.
Definitely. No, well, I think that's like a really positive note to sort of wrap things up on. Actually, we've grilled you on so many different topics, Tom, and you've given us excellent answers, and always very positive answers as well, which has been really fantastic. So I don't know, Chris, have you got any a last question for Tom at all?
No, I think that is a perfect note to end on. Just remains for me to say, yeah, thank you very much, Tom, for answering our quite tricky questions at points. But yeah, you answered them perfectly, and I definitely agree with the message which we're trying to send out. So all the best with it as well. And it seems like, like you said, things might get worse, but hopefully they'll get better as well.
Yeah, I think there's a role for optimism. No, it's been a good discussion. We've gone from aliens to apples to bees to global politics. But yeah, no, it's I think all these issues are kind of, interlinked, and that's why more sort of systems thinking approach and breaking down disciplinary barriers is really essential. And so I'm in the biological sciences department, but I really try and work across different disciplines to address some of these problems, because I think we can't just sort of sit in our silos. So yeah, no, I think this is the type of discussions that we should all be trying to have more.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, thanks again, Tom. It's been wonderful. Cheers.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Well, I have to say that was one of the best podcast episodes we've ever done. The sheer range of knowledge and interdisciplinary expertise that Tom displayed was absolutely astounding. And I think, as he said, that this crossing of boundaries in science will be absolutely essential for human progress in the future. And although we covered so much in our discussions, for me, at the heart of it is the point that modern humans are certainly clever, but are we actually wise? The rate of technological advances has been staggering, but the rate at which we've advanced ethically and have thought about things mindfully and the impacts of these advances to our planet has definitely lagged behind. Hopefully we can progress in these terms, and it was heartening to hear Tom's optimism for global collaboration in the future. We hope you enjoyed listening to the episode as much as we have. Goodbye.